Good morning, everyone. I want to say just right off the bat that we're in the midst of changing from a GoToWebinar format to a Zoom format, and we don't have all the controls set up. So I'm going to ask everyone to turn your cameras off, please, because we are going to get started and get recorded. So if you guys could turn cameras off. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So good morning and welcome to this WIOA Wednesday webinar. My name is Jennifer Phillips with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. I'm joined by my colleague, Kirsten Baer, who's helping on technical support today, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. So today's topic is digital infrastructure, access and skills, an analysis of the digital divide inequities. Just as a reminder, all participants on the call are in listen-only mode. So if you have questions as the webinar proceeds, please post your comment in the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. We've left a lot of time, hopefully today, to take some of your questions. I also want to do a quick thank you to my co-host, Lisa Manalize from Richland Community College, who helped design and organize this webinar today. The webinar will be recorded. The presentation, the recording, and all the materials presented during today's meeting will be available on the icsps.illinoisstate.edu website and also on the Illinois WorkNet website within the next day or two. Tomorrow, each of you will receive a follow-up email that will have a survey asking you about today's webinar. We really appreciate that feedback and any suggestions you have to help improve upcoming webinars. And just as a reminder, if you have any unstable internet connection, you can certainly call in. I think Kirsten may be putting those phone numbers in the chat box. They're also in the invitation that you received. So with that, I'm going to get started by, Kirsten, if you go to the next slide, just to do the quick ground rules. We covered all of those things. And then just as a reminder, to please keep that video box off for the recording. So I'm going to get started by introducing our presenters and the agenda for today. So just a quick note that this is a really big topic with a lot of information to cover. And we've decided to do sort of a part one and a part two. So this part one is really covering the big issues, sort of the landscape of digital divide, and some data points. Part two, we are holding November 4th for that, and it will be focused on state and local innovations in the digital divide and how those innovations are specifically addressing digital divide inequities. So stay tuned for details for that November 4th webinar. So today we have four amazing presenters. I'd like to welcome them. So Amanda Bergson-Shilcock is a senior fellow at the National Skills Coalition. And Kirsten, could you go to the next slide that has the names on it? Yep. And Amanda leads the National Skills Coalition's work on adult education and workforce policies that support US-born and immigrant adults with foundational skills gaps. She is also the lead author of the new landscape of digital literacy that was released back in May, and we will be pushing out those materials throughout the webinar. The second speaker is Matt Schmit from the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, Office of Broadband. Mark is a connectivity evangelist. He's a former member of the Minnesota State Senate, and in just last fall, he was appointed to be the head of this department, the DCEO department, the Office of Broadband. He manages the Connect Illinois program and works with the state's Broadband Advisory Council. There are just countless new things that he's going to be talking about that are happening here in Illinois today. The third presenter is also a native Illinoisan, and her name is Becky Raymond. Becky is the executive director of the Chicago Citywide Literacy Coalition. Becky was the founding director in 2011. And CCLC is also the host for the Illinois Digital Learning Lab. And I know Becky is going to be talking about this a little later during her presentation, but this week is National Adult Education and Family Literacy Week, so it's a great time to be talking about these issues. And then finally, Molly Bashay is with the Center for Law and Social Policy. She's a senior policy analyst. Her work centers around building equitable pathways to quality training and employment opportunities for workers and their families. And Molly, when she was at the National Skills Coalition, was the lead author on a report called the Digital Skills for an Equitable Recovery that was released back in July and will also be something that we push out today. So a huge thank you to our presenters, and excited to hear you today. And so I'm going to turn it over to Amanda.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here with all of you. And I'm particularly excited because my fellow panelists are all such really thoughtful and exciting advocates who are doing really interesting work in their respective areas. So without further ado, I want to launch into a big picture view around digital infrastructure access and skills. I'm going to zoom pretty quickly through these slides. We have given them to you to refer back to after today's conversation. So you'll be able to dig deeper on all of the information I'm sharing using the link that Kirsten provided in the chat. So what has the pandemic really brought home to all of us? It has certainly emphasized the reality that digital skills are important for workers in nearly every corner of our economy. This was true even before the pandemic, but it has absolutely been amplified and emphasized by the quick changing environment that we're all operating in. And as you'll see in the next couple of slides, we're going to walk through some examples of how businesses need digitally literate workers, regardless of what kinds of industries or occupations those workers are working in. These examples actually come from before the pandemic, but since the pandemic, we've seen a significant ramping up of these issues, and happy to chat more about that in the Q&A if folks want to go into that. So where's the first area? We're going to talk first in the next slide about examples of food service, right? So a lot of us have been getting takeout more often since no one's going to restaurants in the pandemic. You may not know that Kentucky Fried Chicken and Honey Grow have been using virtual reality goggles to train workers in food safety. KFC actually has an escape room game that they play with their workers, where workers are in a room with an animated Colonel Sanders who won't let them out of the room in the virtual escape room until they've correctly demonstrated that they know how to fry chicken safely. So it sounds a little goofy and fun, but it's an illustration of even entry-level food service workers are needing to have some digital skills. We see this in other areas as well, and we're going to go through a few more slides pretty quickly here. We see it in home health, right? So there's an interesting pilot in California of using the Amazon Alexa assistant for home health aides to communicate with elders in a nursing home. We see it in other industries as well, as you'll see in the next slide. Grocery workers in particular oftentimes need to complete online training in order to be able to be promoted as a cashier or an assistant manager. The Independent Grocers Association has a whole series of online trainings that grocery workers in independent grocers can complete. We see it as well in other industries. In the next slide, you'll see highlighted. Most folks don't think of construction as an industry that requires a lot of digital skills, but in reality, a lot of construction workers need OSHA 10 safety training, and that training is increasingly offered as online courses. You can see here an example of it getting offered from the University of South Florida. We see it in other industries as well. In the next slide, you'll see more information about augmented reality. So Boeing did a really fascinating pilot where aircraft workers were using augmented reality to use schematics to assemble aircraft parts. Now, if you're sitting here thinking, I'm not 100% sure what augmented reality is, if you've ever played Pokemon Go or used a Snapchat filter, you do know what it is. It's when you use your smartphone's camera to look at something in the real world and then there's a little animated picture or other graphic that's kind of layered on top of the real-life picture that you're looking at through your camera. That's augmented reality, right? So when you take a picture of your child or grandchild and then they have bunny ears layered on top of them, that's what augmented reality is. And then finally, we also see that digital skills are showing up in another industry, and in the next slide, we'll go into that. It's the retail sector, right? We don't think of retail jobs as requiring a lot of, oops, we can go forward again to that slide. We don't think of retail jobs as requiring high-tech skills, but in reality, even before the pandemic, it was increasingly clear that retail workers needed to use smartphone apps to process inventory returns, that people who were customer service folks in the store might need to have a tablet computer to help customers do an online order if the store didn't have the item in stock that they were looking for. So we've seen this just explosion of digital skills across this enormous range of industries and occupations. But the cold reality is that a lot of workers lack the digital skills they need to be able to thrive and be successful in these jobs. And that is really a significant challenge for all of us to be thinking about. National Skills Coalition did a study this spring using data from a very rigorous international assessment and found that approximately 48 million adults in the U.S., or almost 1 in 3 currently employed workers, lack digital skills. This is pre-pandemic data. These are folks who were working at the time of the survey. And you can see here the percentage of folks who had no digital skills compared to those who had very limited skills. It's a significant number of people. In the next slide, you'll see the differences across industry. And the important sort of take-home message from the next slide is that there are similarities in that every industry has skill gaps, and there are differences in that some industries are more effective than others. In construction, at the top of the list, half of all workers have limited or no skills. But even down at the bottom of the list, with education and then the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, between 1 in 6 and 1 in 5 workers have limited skills. So this is an issue that's really true across industries. In the next slide, you'll see that this is also an issue of competitiveness, right? It's an issue for individual workers because when you don't have strong digital literacy skills, you're likely to have low earnings. And you'll see that vividly illustrated in the next chart that we have. And this might seem pretty intuitive to a lot of you, right? If you don't have strong skills in the US, whatever your skills might be, English language, reading, math, you often have lower earnings. And that's very much true for having limited or no digital skills. There's a really strong correlation. On the left, you see folks with no digital skills. On the right, you see the chart of people with limited digital skills. And in both cases, most folks are earning in the bottom 2 quintiles. In the next slide, you'll see that it's also the case that businesses face interesting and challenging skill gaps. Small businesses are more likely to have workers with few or no digital skills. That's the message of the left-hand side of this chart, right? Half of all workers work in small businesses of 1 to 50 employees, but 57% of workers with no digital skills are in small businesses. So small businesses have disproportionate numbers of workers with limited or no skills. And again, we can sort of talk about what might be some of the reasons behind that during the Q&A if folks want to get into that. So those are the economic competitiveness pieces. In the next slide, I want to sort of pull back the camera lens and talk about a couple of other pieces of context that are really important. The first is, this is not just an individual worker problem, right? It's not just about whether that one worker doesn't have the skills they need. It's also because a lot of these folks are supervisors. 1 out of 5 workers with no digital skills are supervising other folks, and 1 out of 3 workers who have limited skills are supervising other folks. We found in our research that supervisors with skill gaps are basically a productivity bottleneck. What do I mean by that? Well, we heard one story in our research of a high-end retail store where most of the information that employees were supposed to have about visual merchandising and other key company policies was available on in-store iPads and the company intranet. Because it's competitive intelligence, you can't access it from home, right? So the workers couldn't go home and be on their own computers and access it. It was only within the store. But because the supervisor didn't have strong digital literacy skills, she was not teaching folks or encouraging them to access the company intranet. And then the other supervisors were getting confused about why the entry-level workers weren't abiding by the corporate guidelines on visual merchandising and display until they found out that the reason was because the entry-level workers weren't using the iPad to look at the corporate instructions. So that's what we mean when we say supervisors can be a productivity bottleneck. Okay. In the next slide, as I come to the end of my comments here, I want to emphasize one other sort of misperception that folks often have, right? Sometimes folks think, well, if they don't have strong digital skills, they probably just don't have to use the computer very much as part of their job. But in reality, we see that over a third, and in some cases close to a half of workers with few or no digital skills are actually required to have moderate or complex computer skills in order to do their job. So what's going on there? People are spending a lot of time and energy trying to cover up and compensate for their skill gaps. It's exhausting. And frankly, it's a drag on productivity for both workers and the companies that employ them. So in the next slide, I just want to recap kind of the take-home messages based on this very whirlwind tour I've just walked you through. What you can do, you can certainly educate policymakers and elected officials about what these skill gaps look like and what they mean. You can advocate for better data collection about digital skill gaps, and you can support dedicated investment through the workforce system, through creative uses of WIOA Title II adult education funding to invest in digital upskilling. We've included some additional charts in our slides in this presentation with links to the underlying data and reports that I have these charts pulled from. So if you're the kind of person that likes to dig into these questions, feel free. You'll have the ability to do that in the slides that we've sent you. And if you feel like this is about the level of detail that you're looking for, I have good news because this is the end of my portion of the presentation. We'll click to the next slide, and I think we'll advance it to my colleagues.
Amanda, fantastic. Thank you so much. One thing that we forgot to do in the beginning of this call was a quick 2-question poll. This poll is going to help, I'm sorry, Amanda, it's not going to help you as much, but it'll help the other 3 panelists understand who is in the audience. So Kirsten, if you wouldn't mind putting up the first poll question. These are just 2 quick poll questions about where you are from in Illinois and what partner kind of organization you represent. So give people a minute to do those poll questions. And while people are doing that, I am going to post, I think I'm going to just do a commercial for the fact that Kirsten put the link in the chat for today's slides and a corresponding handout. One of the things that we did was we took all of the different reports that you're going to hear about today, or as many as we could locate, and we put them in a PDF with clickable links for you. So that's just a commercial that Kirsten put that in the chat. So here you can see that we've got lots of Title I representation and sort of a smattering of different WIOA stakeholder partners as well. Kirsten, could you go to the geography one? We'll give people a minute to answer this one. That's awesome. It really looks like we've got a pretty great representation from Central Illinois and then really sort of a representation statewide. in different regions in the state. So thanks everybody for participating in that poll. Amanda's last comments about educating policymakers and advocating for solutions is an awesome launch pad for Matt Schmit to start his presentation. So Kirsten, if you go to the next slide, and welcome Matt. Thank you for being here.
All right, thank you everybody, and it's a pleasure to join you. And I have a slide deck, and I have more slides than I may have time for today, so I may jump over a few of these faster than otherwise. But if we could advance one slide, I think mine might be next. Maybe the next one. It's maybe the next one yet. There we go. All right. So I've seen this slide deck quite a few times in the last year that I've been in this position, and I'm really excited to share with you, I think, a general overview of what we're up to at the Illinois Office of Broadband. And hopefully you leave this with a message that we're trying to do a lot of different things, but we really want to partner with you specifically on the digital equity, literacy, and adoption front. You know, well, current pandemic environment in which we live. And so I'm going to take, let's see here, I'll take a step right now here, look at this Connect Illinois vision. The last slide was basically just an overview of what I was going to talk about, so we can skip it. But I look at kind of our broadband undertaking here in Illinois as being essentially three legs of a stool. Sorry, another public policy, you know, cliche here, but we look holistically at the idea of how best to invest in broadband. It's not simply about making sure that everybody's got a connection, but rather that it's a reliable, affordable connection and access point to the internet. So that's one leg. Access that's affordable and reliable. Secondly, we want to promote adoption and digital literacy so folks can sign up and subscribe for the internet, and we're not seeing gaps where there are barriers to actually subscription. And then the third is drive utilization. What are we using the internet for? You know, certainly staying connected with family and friends, that's important, but now more than ever, it's how we work, it's how we learn, it's how we engage healthcare. It's so important to our economic competitiveness, our quality of life living in the 21st century. And so access, adoption, utilization, those three legs. The next slide, just a quick shout out to our Connect Illinois website. If you Google Connect Illinois Broadband, it's going to take you right there. You can see a menu of options along the right-hand column there. That's what we do. And we're constantly updating this website to share with the public what we're up to and how you can engage with us. And so I want to just direct folks there in your off time, so to speak. The next slide is a map of where service is and is not in Illinois. This map is not perfect. It's based upon some flawed federal data. We're undertaking our own mapping effort here in Illinois to get a better handle on the broadband access question. But you can see those areas in dark blue tend to be areas of relative broadband strength. The areas in light, that green color, are where we need to focus attention on the basic access front. And then there's a lot of area in Illinois where you may have some access, but it's either not reliable, affordable, or at the bandwidth that you need to succeed. And so we've got a big undertaking here on that access front, investing in infrastructure. Next slide. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but a lot of what we do in the Office of Broadband is oriented to the public, whether it's with individual stakeholders or regions or communities around the state. But a lot of our high-level kind of policy conversation drives through the Broadband Advisory Council, meets quarterly. We organize into different working groups. And I could say more about this, but it's kind of a balance between state agency officials, internet service providers, and then also different interests in the public realm. Aging, you know, Farm Bureau, the libraries, just to name a few. So the next slide. One thing that our Broadband Advisory Council has been asked by the General Assembly to undertake is a study this fall getting at some basic questions around affordability. And so I just want to recognize that the question about affordability is something that our federal and state policymakers are paying more and more attention to, and it's something that we take really seriously here at the Office of Broadband. And so I could say a lot about this slide by itself, but just look for more coming from our office in the Illinois Office of Broadband and the General Assembly on the question about what is affordable broadband, how do we ensure that everybody has access not only to some kind of broadband, but broadband that is affordable too. Next slide. And so this slide kind of points to our broadband strategic plan that was published in February 2020. It kind of sets the stage for how we think and act about broadband. It was published a month before COVID-19 presented in the United States at levels that we're seeing now. And so we may reevaluate some of the things that are in here in light of the tremendous reliance on at-home bandwidth that we've seen in the last 6 months or so. But nonetheless, we think it's a real relevant guidepost for us. We've set a couple of standards in place here in terms of goals. Basic access by 2024. We want everybody to have access to, what the definition of broadband is at the Federal Communications Commission 25/3 level. That's 25 megabits per second down, 3 megabits per second up. That's the most tech talk I'm going to get into today, folks. So I'll spare you. But we also have a longer term goal to make sure that we have the increased bandwidth needs met over time as well. And the whole point here is we're not settling for these small yard markers. Anything that we do in terms of internet investment in Illinois is based upon fully scalable broadband that's going to stand the test of time. And so that's a really important point for us to make. The next slide, we talk about broadband leadership and economic development. We're not operating in a vacuum. We want to make sure that our investments are tied to real outcomes, to use, to putting Illinois in a position to succeed in the 21st century. All right, moving on. A couple of definitions here, how we define broadband, unserved and underserved areas. This kind of ties back to that map. It also speaks to our broadband grant eligibility. I don't want to spend too much time on here. We certainly can come back to this slide if you'd like, but the point is we are trying to partner with the Federal Communications Commission to set uniform standards on what is and what is not broadband. And a number of states, I think, are going to take the lead on this and push the FCC to demand more out of our broadband effort federally. And so this is our Connect Illinois Round 1. We have the nation's largest competitive matching grant fund, $400 million available. In Round 1, we had $50 million leverage, $65 million of non-state match for a total broadband investment of over $115 million. That means 26,000 plus new or improved connections to homes, families, businesses, community anchors around the state. And so this was just Round 1. You can see there's a good balance geographically. Well, at least there's somewhat of a balance geographically. We're looking for some parts of the state to step up with good applications for Round 2 and beyond. And our second round of funding is likely to be posted in the next couple of weeks. And so that's our infrastructure piece, that access leg of the stool. Here's some criteria that we use for making those decisions in the next slide. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the whole point is we want to have a balance between project readiness and sustainability, but also meaningful community engagement and a focus on leveraging current infrastructure to the extent that we can, but also driving broadband adoption and in paying attention to affordability and use. And so the next slide, coming back to that broadband strategic plan, we had articulated that access, the goals. This slide here speaks to our investment in community planning and capacity building, the fact that we want to work with local communities to help them become savvier, more educated, in a better position to achieve their broadband goals. And so the next slide speaks to our Illinois Connected Communities program. We have a similar map here. We have 12 communities, whether they're neighborhoods in Chicago, counties throughout the state, or actually entire regions, like in the case of the Southwest Leadership Council of Southwest Illinois, that we're engaging through 50 plus hours of expert consultation, access to best practice curriculum. And this is through a partnership with the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society based in Evanston, and also local philanthropy. And the whole point is we want to help these communities think holistically about broadband, access, adoption, utilization over a 12-month period, so they're in a better position on the back end to make meaningful change in partnership with us and others on the broadband front. And then the last piece, and I think this is maybe the most relevant to today's conversation, I will wrap it up real quickly. Another aspect of our broadband strategic plan is a focus on digital literacy, adoption, and inclusion. And what does that mean? That's really getting at that utilization piece, closing equity gaps beyond the simple access and infrastructure gap that exists, talking about affordability and use in meaningful ways, and making sure that everybody in Illinois has an opportunity not only to connect, but to utilize the internet to maximum benefit. And that isn't a matter of just throwing dollars at programs, rather it's engagement that's meaningful, that's community oriented. And so the next slide it speaks to one effort that we've made towards digital equity in the very short term, and that's trying to identify publicly available Wi-Fi throughout the state of Illinois. This map is available on our website. It's not perfect. It's not this long-term solution to our connectivity challenges, but it's something that we can point to and say, if you're in a pinch and you're looking for public Wi-Fi, here's a map that can help you out in the short term. And then lastly, and this is the thing that I really wanted to point to today, and I'll do this real quick, our programming and partnership around digital equity. And we're really excited to announce in the month of September here yet, so we got a week yet, and moving into October, some really interesting work on the digital equity front. And we've welcomed PCs for People, probably the nation's most reputed computer refurbishing nonprofit, into Illinois to set up what we hope is going to be a statewide computer refurbishing network that plays a strong role in helping our current computer refurbishing efforts at local levels access increased supply of used computers, that they can be cleaned, refurbished, updated with new software and hardware, and given to families in need, so that they have a device at home that's not just for the student, but for older brothers and sisters or mom and dad or grandparents that need to access the internet. And so finally, I'll just mention we've got some grants coming down the pike. Keep an eye out. We'd love to partner with communities around the state on the digital equity front. And so I hope I didn't take up too much time there. That's the, I got one last question with a little contact, or I'm sorry, slide with my contact information. Otherwise, that's all I have right now.
Matt, that was terrific. Thank you so much. And it's a great, your presentation is another great launching point to welcome Becky Raymond from the Chicago Citywide Literacy Coalition. And I think you're going to hear from Becky all about that utilization, coordination, partnership, and coalition building around digital literacy for adults and families. Becky, you want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jennifer, for the introduction and for the invitation to be on this panel. It's great to be with colleagues talking about such an important issue, and especially on AEFL week. It's a highlight for me to be here today. So for those of you that are not familiar with CCLC, we are a coalition of more than 40 adult education providers in Chicago and across the state. We've started expanding our network to reach all across the state. And we have been working in the digital literacy space for 6 years, when our members came to us and said, if we had better technology, if we could help our learners learn outside of class, you know, we could get stronger outcomes. And so we've been really on this journey for 6 years. And last year, we adopted the Illinois Digital Learning Lab from New Ventures Foundation, and with the support of the Grand Victoria Foundation. So we're announcing our second round of applicants, cohort members today. And so I'll focus mainly on our work in IDLL. Next slide, please. So this is some of the need that we identified through last year's implementation of IDLL. And I think these numbers are pretty familiar to most people in Illinois in this space. But one thing I really want to call attention to is that in IDLL, we found that 85 of the learners who participated in the program tested below proficient in digital literacy skills. So, you know, contrasting this with the data that Amanda introduced, we can really see that IDLL is able to work with and identify individuals with the greatest needs. So it was a high concentration of individuals who had very limited digital literacy skills in the program. And I think that's what we set out to do when we found those people, and we're really able to help them through the project. Next slide, please. So what is the project? IDLL worked with 26 adult educators from 22 organizations, and the map shows kind of where the educators were located. You can see that we went all the way to the top and all the way to the bottom of Illinois in our in our coverage of the state. And of course, there's a big star in Chicago because that's where we have our base of members, but that is expanding. We divided the educators into 5 cohorts, and they met monthly with subject matter experts who really coached them, problem solved with them, helped them figure things out. And the whole project is managed by CCLC's technology project manager, Michael Matos, who has a very extensive background in adult education and technology, enhanced instruction and digital literacy. So I know he's on the call, and I want to recognize him for his great work in managing the project. We reached 1,200 learners. We distributed 200 devices to educators across the state, and they experimented with hundreds of different software tools. Next slide, please. Just some of the educator reflections. I think what we really learned in the past year is to start early in the adult education classroom in teaching digital literacy. Start with lower level learners. It can be done. I think there's been kind of a mindset in adult education to save digital literacy for higher level learners. And what we found in the lab is that it's not necessary to wait and to teach digital literacy up front. And sometimes it gets a bit neglected because the metrics are around reading and math. And so educators have prioritized those areas, and understandably so. But through IDLL, we're really making the case to teach digital literacy from the beginning at the lower levels and make it a part of the classroom culture throughout. Okay, next slide, please. And so some of our educators had the reflections to keep it simple. And point number 2 is really what we're focusing on. Technology can and should be used at every level. And technology opens the door to wider networks. I know that we're here today talking about it in terms of workforce, but technology is so critical for all of the access, community access issues that our workforce rests upon. So we need to have health. We need to have parents engaged in their children's education. All of these foundational pieces are so important for a thriving workforce. And I think that through the pandemic, we've all seen how important the social safety nets are so that adult education can function and workforce development can function. Okay, next slide, please. So in the midst of us running our first round of IDLL, COVID-19 happened, and we really saw just how critical being connected to learners using technology in the classroom is. I mean, we can't even emphasize it enough. And our educators who had started working with their learners in technology, in Google Classroom with different softwares, they were ready to make the switch so much more seamlessly than those who had not implemented it as quickly. So we really saw the benefit of having learners connected. And of course, echoing Matt's comments of the 3-pronged stool, lack of internet access, lack of devices, lack of basic digital literacy skills, all of this just came front and center through the pandemic. Next slide, please. So kind of in summary, I'll just share that one thing we are really focusing on at CCLC, IDLL has focused on the educators, and that's been our model. But now we really need to think of how whole programs can move to remote and virtual. And on October 9th, I'll give a bit of a plug for a webinar that Michael Matos is putting together on how to do program recruitment and enrollment virtually. So it's not just the classroom instruction, but how do we help individuals come into programs when we don't have our normal outreach and engagement activities? Through this time, I've been feeling like, in adult education, we have really, potlucks and in-person interaction has been how we have connected to community. And so making the shift to technology is huge for us and so important so that learners don't get left behind. We're really encouraged by efforts like Chicago Connected, and we've been working to support the community-based organizations that are rolling up their sleeves and helping 60,000 BPS households connect to free broadband. So we really want to support their success and amplify any efforts to connect individuals to broadband, and then make sure that they also have the opportunity to develop digital literacy skills. Getting devices out to those who need them. We're very encouraged by PC for People that Matt mentioned. We want to see more of that, and we want to support any efforts to help get devices out. We have been giving out devices in the time of COVID, and we just can barely keep up with the demand from our members to get these devices into the hands of families that need them. So we're excited about that. And we are really into North Star digital literacy as a tool to help learners see where they are with their digital literacy skills and help them build it. And we have a North Star sponsorship. If you're not familiar with North Star, it's a digital literacy assessment online, and learners can achieve badges and certificates to show their digital literacy skills. And we really feel like using North Star will get everyone on the same page and put digital literacy instruction at the forefront of adult education and workforce too. We know a lot of our Title I partners use North Star. So that's kind of where we are now. We're sending out the announcement today of the 30 educators who will be in our next round of IDLL. This time we will be working with educators for 2 years. We'll be having ongoing webinars every other month. I mentioned the one on virtual recruitment that we're having on October 9th, but this will be an ongoing series, and we will continue to advocate for equitable access to broadband and technology.
Super. Thank you, Becky. And Molly, before I kick you off, I just want to mention a couple of things that are being posted to the chat. So I just posted, Michael Matos will be presenting at the ICCB Forum for Excellence tomorrow at 11:30. I put the, I believe that that's a free registration. I put the information there. And also, it looks like Robert from CCLC also put in some of the Illinois Digital Learning Lab links, and I posted the community partners and the website for Chicago Connected if people wanted to learn more about that. Just wanted to do that before kicking Molly off. So we are so thrilled that Molly Bashay from class could be here today to be sort of the end anchor on our relay on digital divide. One of the things that I absolutely love about the report that she wrote in July is really focusing on what are the incentives? How do you incentivize this digital fluency and digital access that we are talking about? And how, to come back to some of the points that Amanda made about how companies are will thrive or not thrive based on how digitally fluent their employees are. You know, what's at stake for them? How do we think about new partnerships, and how do we think about incenting them to help on the investment front of this? So Molly, thank you for being here, and take it away.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you first off for inviting me, and thanks everyone who signed on today. I'm Molly Bashay. I am a senior policy analyst with CLASP. CLASP is a national nonpartisan anti-poverty nonprofit, and I'm here to talk about some practical solutions to help bring about increased digital fluency for an equitable recovery. And next slide, please. We'll start off pretty basic. All of my other co-presenters here have covered this to some degree, but digital inequities are basically under a major spotlight since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. More now than ever, digital skills are a necessity for workers, for businesses, for trading providers, and without them, so many people are being left behind. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing as a factor of this rapid digital transformation is actually this disruption is following a familiar path of exclusion. So even before the pandemic, we know that structurally racist and exclusionary systems disadvantaged people of color and others with structural barriers to employment. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that these effects are also spilling over into areas of access to digital technologies and the opportunities people have for digital skill building. Next slide. So I say this to preface that racial equity gaps are still persisting in the landscape of digital skills. And what we know from the data is that Black people, and especially Latinx workers, are overrepresented among those people with digital skill gaps based on their share of the workforce. And also immigrant workers have large digital skills needs, and specifically English language learners. There's some overlap, of course, in that group of immigrant workers, but that doesn't tell the whole story. But English language learners actually have the largest digital skill needs, with fully 2/3 of English language learners lacking some digital skills. And I start that and say that saying to, I preface that with that gaps in these digital skills actually directly relate to the availability of digital tools and digital devices and broadband access. This doesn't occur in a vacuum. The digital divide between people who have broadband access and people who have no access, or people who have cell phone only access, is a huge barrier to accessing education and training opportunities and re-entering the workforce. And this has never been more true now that we've seen this dramatic resurgence of digital technology use in work, switch to remote work, and really just a rapid transformation of how work is done. But the digital divide is never more prevalent than right now, with more than 20 million US households having no internet access, another 9 million only having mobile access. And then this issue of reliable access is also compounded in rural America, where nearly 1/3 of residents lack fixed mobile broadband access. And again, this lack of full access, reliable access to the internet really hampers any worker's ability to develop digital literacy and then access those digital learning tools to upskill. Next slide, please. So this compounds with barriers that were already keeping workers from upskilling. Even before the pandemic, financial constraints, taking time off from work, securing childcare, all served as barriers to upskilling. This is before, say, the new remote school year started, so workers who already had barriers to upskilling with securing childcare are now contending with their own dependents, their own children who have to engage in remote work, and are just compounding the difficulties of accessing digital technologies and navigating digital technologies and finding the opportunity and ability to upskill. So, next slide, yes, thank you. So while all of these labor market effects and this rapid workforce digitalization is really unprecedented, we haven't seen anything of this nature with the current pandemic. That doesn't it doesn't follow that the policies and practices we need to meet the demands of workers and businesses aren't available, aren't well established, aren't tools that are already in our toolbox. So luckily there's things that we can draw on right now that in a lot of ways states and also policymakers, practitioners have the ability to enforce right now. Next slide, please. So one immediate challenge that we know businesses and trading providers are contending with is simply they need guidance to be able to upskill workers to succeed in this rapidly changing, rapidly digitalizing economy. Next slide. This is where we need the federal government immediately to step in. First and foremost, we just need a definition of digital literacy, and we need something that practitioners, we need something that workers and businesses can all convene around as a relevant definition that is then embedded in all of the legislation, education legislation, workforce legislation like WIOA, the Higher Education Act, Perkins. So everyone, all the practitioners and programs that flow out of that can be aligned with new quality standards, and we know where to go from here. And second, on top of that, yes, thank you. We also need an evaluation of the current landscape to determine not only where industry is right now in the pandemic with what digital skills are necessary, but where are we going? What education and employment outcomes are going to give workers and businesses the skills they need? From there, we need Congress to really evaluate that, embed it, and then uplift digital literacy as the core competency that it is, and then increase funding commensurate with that. Next slide, please. And on the state side, states obviously need support too. They need support with how to develop and implement quality programs that respond to this rapid need to digitalize. And from there, we've seen great success, and next slide, please. We've seen great success in other types of programs with apprenticeships and other federal programs and pass-through grants, which help build state capacity. What we recommend in the report, which I believe will be sent out to you, is a sort of dual grant program that not only helps build capacity through state formula grants, but also issues a competitive grant that helps uplift those small scale examples where, say, libraries are having great success, but on a very small scale of helping workers, helping learners build their digital skills, and then spur that innovation, scale that innovation, and help bring that to a larger level, a state level, a regional level, and help the best practices grow and gain salience. Next slide, please. And while we're waiting on the federal government, there are still things that state agencies can do. States can first and foremost just better analyze existing data sets to determine which program characteristics already exist and which ones are correlated with the favorable outcomes for learners. It's also really important to understand whether existing digital learning methods are producing equitable outcomes and how those programs might be improved to narrow equity gaps, especially racial equity gaps in learning and outcomes. Next slide, please. Another challenge that we're seeing is simply that small and mid-sized employers, when they're looking to rapidly upskill, they don't necessarily have the tools they need, the funds they need to keep pace when we're seeing digitalization at such a rapid clip. A policy practice where we've seen success, next slide please, is actually the implementation of tax policies like the Work Opportunity Tax Credit. This is already in existence. So an expansion of the rules of this, or of the bounds of the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, to help incentivize private investment in digital skills training, instruction, and upskilling for those incumbent workers, and especially for incumbent workers with structural barriers to employment, is where we're going to see a lot of success and a lot of impact. But again, next slide, states can also take some action and have some flexibility. State policymakers right now can help by reallocating some of their rapid response funds to support and assist disconnected workers who are facing digital skill needs, and help them build those competencies and help them then transition to new employment that requires those digital competencies to succeed. Next slide, please. And the last challenge that we'll talk about that we've been seeing, we saw in the research, and we're seeing even more so now under the pandemic, is that when small businesses, medium-sized businesses are looking to upskill their incumbent workforces, a lot of times just because of their size, because of their nature, they don't have that internal capacity. But at the same time, a lot of external training providers may not have the program availability, may not have the curriculum they need to respond immediately to business need. Next slide. So the tried and true practice for this is always going to be blending funding and also empowering innovation through sector partnerships. Now, there's a possibility here for state and federal action and investment in creating a network of partnerships between those businesses, education providers, the public workforce system, community organizations, to help essential businesses find skilled workers for in-demand jobs and help build those digital competencies into career pathways. And we've even seen, in response to the pandemic, local partnerships forming and creating digital training, digital upskilling credentials that meet the current moment, specifically in health sectors and in the care economy, to respond to workforce and safety protocols that relate to COVID. But of course, there's always going to be the federal option where we could see expanded investment in the Higher Education Act and in Perkins. But even in the absence of that action, states have some options to empower some innovation. And I'll stop there. That was a very quick run through for some options that states and federal and some practical solutions for how to help build digital fluency and digital skills. And I'll stop it right there.
Molly, thank you. Your to-do list is awesome, both federally and at the state level. Before we start launching into questions, we have a couple other poll questions. So Kirsten, if you wouldn't mind putting those up, we thought we would kick off the discussion portion of this webinar by asking you guys for some more engagement and feedback. So we're going to put that one. And the first one, hopefully people can see, yep, can see it. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the worst, how would you rank digital access as a problem in your community? We'll give people a minute to do that. And while you're doing the poll questions, we have a couple of kickoff questions for discussion. But please, if you have questions for the panelists, start putting them in the chat, and we will read them. So really kind of an interesting, not everybody's in the worst category, but definitely a strong band of, almost, yeah, it's still coming in. I was going to say over 70% that are, struggle with, whether digital access is a problem in your community. Kirsten, let's end that poll and go to the second question. So similar format on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the worst, how would you rank digital skills as a problem in your community? And while people are answering that poll, I just want to do a shout out. I just put another one of the shorter pieces that Molly did while she was at the National Skills Coalition called Applying a Racial Equity Lens to Digital Literacy. It's also in the PDF handout, but put the direct link in the chat as well. So this is a stronger, problem in terms of digital skills being a problem with, 3, let's see, on the bottom tier of this being over 85% or so. And Kirsten, if we could go to the last poll question. Thank you. So this is a choice question. What's the biggest barrier in your work on digital access and skills? So from where you sit, and go ahead and put other answers in the chat box. We just threw out a couple, but we'll give you a minute to answer that one. Oh, you know what? Hey, Kirsten, I'm getting in the chat that people cannot see the poll results. Can they, I'm seeing them on my screen, but can they not see the poll results?
They can if I go ahead and share the results at the end of the polls, but I was just moving from poll to poll. So I will share the results for this one.
Sorry. I was thinking that they could see my screen. Sorry, everybody that's on the call. I should have been more specific and what your answers were. I thought you could see what I could see. My apologies. Our apologies. So for this one, you know, the job seeker lack of digital skills is the highest at 46%, but I'm going to go ahead and let Kirsten share those poll results for those 3 questions to the audience. And we've got some people that are, pardon me?
They're sharing right now.
Perfect. And that's, you're going to, Kirsten, are you going to go through each one of them to show results?
I think I can do that. Yes. Hold on.
There are a lot of people also saying on the biggest barrier that it's an all of the above question or answer.
So this one, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rank digital skills as a problem in your community? These were the results from this one.
With 50% having 4 as a not such a great answer. And then for the second one, how would you rank? Access, right?
Access, yeah. Access, this is the results for that one.
Perfect. Thanks, Kirsten. And if you could flip to the last one, we'll do a quick viewing and then I'll go into asking a question. So this is the digital access as a problem. Sorry, the biggest barrier to your work. The lack of job seeker lack of digital skills is the highest, but many people in the chat are writing all of the above for those things. So thanks everybody for your engagement on those poll questions. I'm going to turn it over to a roundtable discussion and throw some questions out to our panelists. So last Friday, Deutsche Bank released a study that put a spotlight on the racial tech gap in the United States. This echoes many of the things that Molly was just talking about. The author was quoted on NPR this week saying that the data showed that Black and Hispanic communities were effectively 10 years behind white communities, and that this, combined with the rapid digitization and automation of the US economy, that gap could eventually mean that large numbers of Black and Hispanic American workers could be sort of disqualified or underprepared for 86% of jobs in the United States by 2045. So that is a big task for all of us on the call. So I wanted to kind of kick this off by asking each of the panelists to reflect on, how does this study reinforce the work that you're doing on digital access and literacy, especially in terms of the racial equity gap? Matt, maybe I'll, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, I think a lot of the things that you're focused on really are getting at the core of this, this study. And I'll put the study in the chat.
Yeah, great report. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I think it's really pertinent to everything we're talking about today and certainly our work at the Office of Broadband. You take a step back and I think a lot of the quick takes and also the longer studies, in terms of the impacts of the global pandemic are that it's exacerbating existing gaps, particularly on racial basis. And so if you ask the question, why is that happening? You can talk about, okay, what's an essential worker or a non-essential worker? Who's actually having contact with people in the workplace? But if you go further still, I think it really speaks to this gap that we have in digital access and skills and just being connected in a meaningful way in the 21st century. And so sadly, I don't think the results of that Deutsche study are surprising. And in my mind, it shines a bright light on the work that we're all doing together and the urgency with which we proceed. These gaps are alarming to begin with, and they're just getting bigger. And so when you talk about, targeting resources in an equitable way, trying to shrink gaps, I think that this calling is as important as ever. The calling of broadband access and not just making sure that there's infrastructure in place, but as we had talked about earlier, that holistic approach, to addressing access, adoption, utilization, and applying that affordability and equity lens to everything we do to make sure that truly folks are not falling through the cracks. And so I could go on and on here, right? But I just think it's a really timely study. It's a really important, piece to incorporate into everything that we do. And again, I think it just shines a bright light on what we're doing and how, forging partnerships, targeting resources, more important than ever.
Thanks, Matt. Anybody else want to jump in?
This is Amanda. I would add two things to that, which I strongly agree with. The first is when we talk about racial equity and digital literacy, it's really important to keep in mind how structural racism helps create some of those inequities. So just to take a really simple example, when we think about families having access to high-speed broadband at home, we know that if you don't have good credit, then you are less likely to be eligible for low-cost broadband. And we also know from extensive other research that families of color are disproportionately likely to have poor credit, often because of structural racism. So that's an example where it's not the failing of an individual person, it's really a structural problem. And I think it's important when we think about these equity gaps to keep in mind that public policies helped create a lot of these problems, and therefore public policies can be a really important part of the solution. The other piece I wanted to mention is really just emphasizing not underestimating people, right? Our study was a two-part study. We did data analysis that sort of looked at big stats, but we also did interviews, qualitative interviews with folks. And we found over and over again that fragmented knowledge is a pretty common situation, right? And so when we say fragmented knowledge, that means maybe a person is comfortable texting something or creating a TikTok video, but they're not comfortable making a spreadsheet. And so the task of digital literacy and digital equity is really how do we help people build bridges from the knowledge they have to the skills they need? And how do we make sure we're not underestimating people or dismissing them when we just focus on the deficits and all of the ways in which they face challenges? So the deficits are real, we need to pay attention to them, but they're often structural and we need to have structural solutions. And we also have to keep in mind that people are pretty darn ingenious. And so figuring out ways to tap into that creativity and that ingenuity is really powerful when we're thinking about narrowing equity gaps in digital inclusion.
Thank you, Amanda. This is Jennifer. I've been doing some pro bono volunteering with Chicago Connected, the program to get 60,000 households 4 years of broadband that Becky mentioned. And one of the things that I've been reinforcing to them is that 60,000 adults or guardians are not a homogeneous group, that you cannot, as Amanda just said, underestimate or make assumptions about their starting places, their ending places, their dreams, their goals, and what they're capable of doing. And so what that means is that they really have to have a spectrum or a range of different digital upskilling options that go all, from foundational to higher level learning or credential seeking online. So anyway, just to reinforce, I absolutely agree with that. And I think somebody else may be jumping in, Molly or Becky.
Yeah, this is Molly. I did just want to say thank you, Amanda, for calling out the systems-based approach versus, the deficits individual-based approach. That was, when I first heard this question, that was immediately what I glommed onto. That just the way that this is worded, while the findings are valid, and we understand that there are access gaps, there are skill needs that communities of color certainly have, and that are going to create issues with their ability to access good jobs and then advance in their careers and find economic security and achieve that. Forming that question, forming that idea as an individual failing as these people are unprepared for the jobs of the future is ultimately unproductive based on the structural racism and structural exclusionary forces that have created that system. So thank you just for calling that out. I don't have anything particular to add, but I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about digital literacy and access and how we can help subvert those structural forces that are perpetuating racism and exclusionary practices.
Becky, did you have a comment? And if you don't, I was going to jump on something that Molly just said as the next question.
No, I mean, I just agree with the panel. We have to think in systems and we have to create opportunities through digital literacy, because it's the foundation of our world now. So we have to be very intentional in creating a structure that is inclusive.
And with that in mind, one of the things that Molly mentioned was thinking about digital literacy definitions. There was an attempt congressionally to have a digital literacy act with some of those definitions. Short of something happening on the federal front, Molly, are there states that are, or any of the panelists, are there states that are starting to create their own systemic definitions and definitions that have racial equity lenses like built into those definitions? For instance, Illinois cross-agency developed a career pathways dictionary, a set of common definitions and terms that multiple state agencies agreed on and is used kind of as a framework in this state. Are there examples in other states where those definitions are happening? And I'm curious what all four panelists think about Illinois trying to create its own set of definitions.
I'll just go ahead and say the most concerted and combined definition I've seen is both in the Digital Equity Act and coming out of NDIA, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. I can't say that I've seen a specific state example of that coming together with a combined definition across agencies, but I definitely appreciate the work that you all have done, and that seems actually really exciting to bring together so many agencies in that combined thought and planning and strategizing around digital access and skills and that commonality.
And I'm curious, Matt, is the Broadband Council kind of thinking about that? Do you think that there are any opportunities for an Illinois, a way to have a definition be created in Illinois?
Absolutely. I think, well, I can just tell you, we're pivoting in our program. I mean, we are a year old and we started out on the infrastructure front because that's what we were primarily charged with doing, not messing up this historic investment in infrastructure. We've pivoted towards community planning, capacity building, and engagement to our Illinois Connected Communities program. And now we have some modest resources and certainly some programmatic, focus on digital equity. And so I'm glad that the National Digital Inclusion Alliance came up. NDIA is respected as kind of the best in the business, I think, in terms of thinking about digital equity and inclusion. And they offer some definition and a framework for identifying gaps and taking next steps. And so I don't want to jump the gun here, but we've been talking about them playing a role in Illinois. And so I think there's a number of conversations that we can follow up in the days and weeks ahead on how to make that happen and fit it into your communities and make it meaningful. But I think the short answer is this is integral to our work. We can't simply invest in infrastructure without taking into account the digital equity aspect of literacy and adoption and use. And so I'm really interested, I hate to kind of punt on this, but I'm really interested in putting my finger on what is a targeted approach, for Illinois that builds upon local interest and effort that we can either pilot in certain cases, or that we can scale up or replicate in others. And so right now our office is focused in our Broadband Advisory Council focused on these issues. And so the timing could not be better for us, if I could say selfishly, that this sort of conversation today and what comes of it is really helpful. So thanks. I didn't mean to go on and on.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, please.
Sorry, yeah, this is Amanda. I would just add a couple things. First of all, National Skills Coalition is having conversations with several states that are interested in advancing state-level policy on digital literacy and digital inclusion. I will say the Pacific Northwest is kind of out front of the rest of the country at this point. So if the Midwest wants to step up, we would love to engage more with Illinois. But there's a couple of other tendrils that folks might be interested in. First of all, there was a great question from Lisa in the chat about whether there's particular legislation that folks could advocate for. There is a bill that's been introduced in the US Congress. So there's federal legislation called the Digital Equity Act. Molly's report, Digital Skills for an Equitable Recovery, kind of lays out a vision for what digital literacy upskilling grants could look like if they were enacted by either the feds or at the state level. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is there are a handful of states that have taken that North Star digital literacy assessment that Becky was mentioning earlier and kind of embedded that as a standard in their adult education systems to be able to do measurable skill gains for adults in the WIOA Title II system. That's obviously not the kind of big picture investment and definition of digital literacy that we've been talking about here, but I think it's a really important interim step. There's a couple of states in New England, Minnesota, where North Star originated, and I think Alabama has also been kind of a leader in picking up on North Star as a digital assessment tool. I know also that a lot of organizations recently submitted comments to the Federal Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education around the urgency of better ways to measure digital literacy skills and better definitions at the national level. So the feds are definitely hearing that from advocates in the field. And I'm happy to chat offline with anybody who wants to kind of dig deeper on particular avenues for advocacy.
Yeah,
Amanda, thank you.
Yeah, and this is Becky. I would really love for us to be part of a conversation about digital equity and inclusion and what that looks like in the state. I think, to your point, Jennifer, it's great that there's one, a dictionary of career pathways terms, but career pathways rest upon digital inclusion. So it seems so critical now more than ever to have that conversation.
Absolutely. That's exactly, to have that out there without being any definition at the state level, regardless of what happens at the federal level, feels like it's something to put on our to-do list. I'm just checking to see if there are more questions in the chat and not seeing any. I wanted to ask all four of you, about what advice you have for local leaders in terms of getting involved with advancing digital access and literacy in their communities. What are some of the things that people can do here in Illinois? And then the flip side of that is what do you need? Matt and Becky especially, what do you need participants on this call to know or to do next?
So I can start with this, and I'll keep my remarks brief because I've been talking a lot. But I think one thing that would be great for us to do is to be able to identify those either communities or efforts that are finding some success or have potential that we can pair with an overarching structure. We've been talking to national groups in kind of a larger sort of framework to apply to this conversation. But it only works if we make the connections to the local level and to the kind of organic, approach that is emanating. And so that's the point that we're at right now, is trying to kind of take a snapshot of, whether it's on a regional basis or drilling down into communities, what's working, where are the interests, are there opportunities for partnership, and how do we make those connections with a truly statewide approach, but that is responsive to individual community, priorities. So
Perfect.
just that.
And this is, I should also probably put in a plug, and Lisa, if you wanted to chime in and go off mute at all, Lisa and I are working on the second part of this webinar. There was no way in 90 minutes to cover in depth, like a showcase of different local and state examples, but that's what we'll be working on for a November 4th webinar, Wednesday, 10 to 11:30 on November 4th. We've got a couple great examples, and actually the North Star examples that are happening within public libraries as a trusted community space are one of the examples that'll be showcased, as well as a lot more detail on some of the coalition building and partnership building of the Chicago Citywide Literacy Coalition. So just a quick little plug before we end, that's coming. And if anyone on this call has something that they would like to showcase or highlight, please reach out to us. let us know if you have something that you would want to be showcased on that November 4th webinar.
Great. Jennifer, if I can just jump in on your question about local leaders and what they can do. I just want to emphasize we have some tools already that folks can use creatively to support digital access, digital devices, and digital skill building. National Skills Coalition did a recent blog post highlighting how federal TANF dollars, temporary assistance for needy families, SNAP employment and training dollars, SNAP ENT, CARES Act funding, which is the COVID relief bill that passed in Congress back in March, how different states and localities can use those federal policies to support different digital inclusion activities. So in the interim, you know, in a time when a lot of state budgets are really in crisis, when programs are really struggling with tight budgets, thinking creatively about how to use federal money is really, I think, powerful and important. And that's one thing I would point folks to. The second thing I would point folks to is sort of taking your own practitioner wisdom and packaging it in a way that it's easy for folks to grasp, right? So those of you who are running programs, seeing job seekers, serving adult learners, you already have really powerful data about how many of your learners are accessing services virtually, about what the barriers have been for your staff and for others, and thinking about whether you might want to do a quick 600-word op-ed, have a meeting with your local newspaper editorial board, talk to your local public radio station to see if they might want to do a short story. That can be a really powerful way to raise the visibility of this issue. We've seen a lot of coverage in the news about K-12 students and how digital access is affecting them. We've seen some coverage of higher education students, that is full-time, year-round enrolled college students. But we have not seen nearly as much coverage about the issues of digital inclusion that face adult workers and adult learners. And you all on today's call really have that on-the-ground expertise. So I'm going to encourage you to sort of package that expertise in a short press release with a couple of statistics, with a vivid photo or an illustrative quote from one of your participants that can really help journalists and funders and elected officials to connect the dots, to understand why this is an issue not just for K-12 kids, not just for 18 to 22-year-old college students, but for people in all age groups and at all levels of the economy. It's a really powerful moment that we're in right now, and I'd love to see more folks capitalizing on that and using it to lift up both the good work you're already doing and your need for increased resources to be able to do that work better.
Amanda, that is an amazing recommendation, and you've got my gears going on how to help the people on this call and more create a toolkit using some of the information that you guys have all shared today to kind of have a good template to go, you know, to go on. So thank you for that. We've got 6 minutes left, and I'm going to throw out one final question, kind of lightning round to the four of you. With the heaviness in today's world, and on a positive note, what is the most interesting next step in your work on digital access and literacy, and like what are you bursting with excitement about that you want to share with this audience?
I'll go first. This is Becky. I feel like announcing the next round of the lab today has got me very excited. I'm very grateful to continue doing this work. And I just want to mention that what Amanda mentioned about SNAP ENT training dollars, I would love to see more of those funds utilized by adult education students. So that is something we really need to think hard about here in Illinois because it doesn't happen enough. So I guess ending positively, we've got our work cut out for us. So, and I'm thrilled to work with the educators in the lab and learn more about this topic.
Fantastic, thank you. Molly, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. We've talked about it a little bit already, but something that I'm always most excited about is really just finding those local examples where very localized, very small scale digital skills instruction is going extremely well. And most of the time they're like learning circles in a library where these circles, they're almost organic in how they come about. And now, of course, everything's shifted to fully remote, and we're trying to research how that ecosystem changes and how that thrives still when the environment has changed, when the setting has changed, and how those services continue to reach people who use libraries as that central access point, and how we continue to maintain those connections from people into public spaces.
Fantastic. That's such a good thing to keep our eyes on. Matt, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So at the outset, you know, it was made public that I'm a retired politician. And so I don't want to pander, but I truly mean this. I think putting our finger on ways to collaborate in this space is something that I'm really excited about, because not all states are doing it. Not all states are doing it well. And I think we have a real opportunity here in Illinois, just given, I think, the focus on broadband and the world that we're living in right now and everything that's already happening to partner in new and meaningful ways. And so that's something that I'm really excited about. And then related to that, you know, we do have another round of funding coming out that's going to be more focused on digital equity. And so, again, those partnerships and making all this talk real, at least from my perspective, in our involvement is something I'm really looking forward to.
Fantastic. Thank you. Who am I missing?
Oh, this is Amanda.
Amanda.
Yeah.
Great.
So I'm most excited about the intersection between arts and culture and digital inclusion. And I say this because as a policy advocate, you might think that I spend all my time thinking about stats and, you know, arguments and testimony and reports, and I do a lot of that. But there's a wonderful quotation from the musician Elvis Costello that goes, a song can't change your mind, but a song can change your heart, and your heart can change your mind. And when I look at the kind of videos and other kind of learning tools that people are using digital technology to create in this moment, and they're using it to comment and critique city council meetings, to push back against policymakers who are advancing policies they disagree with, that is what's enormously exciting to me. The intersection between digital literacy skills that are valuable not just for people as economic contributors and as workers and as learners and as parents, but as civic members of our community, and using art as part of the public conversation about what kind of world we want to live in and what kind of society we want to be.
What a fantastic way to end. Thank you, Amanda. That's amazing. I mean, I think that intersection to me says where is the creative space going? And all four of your comments sort of led to partnership and collaboration, creativity, thinking disruptively, and focusing on our values, especially when it relates to the huge gaps that we were just talking about for members of the Latinx and African American communities in terms of digital divide inequities. So I just want to wrap up by saying thank you to our amazing panel for your time and energy today. It was fantastic. And thank you to all the participants that are still here for attending. As stated earlier in the webinar, we'll be doing a follow-up email that has a survey. The quality of these webinars is really tied to the feedback and the suggestions you have given us. For instance, it was Lisa's suggestion on a webinar on IT career pathways back in July that gave us the idea to do this webinar today. So thank you again, and stay tuned for part 2, information about part 2 on November 4th. So thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.